Welcome back to the Real Recovery Show. We air every Friday at noon. And today's topic is one that hits home for me like none other. It is on anger, it's on fear, it's on PTSD, and it really delves deep into not just what it's about and how it can affect you without you being aware of it, but also some of the things that you can do in the privacy of your own home without having to have a conversation with another person that can seriously start to give you tools and empowerment to not only readdress some of the things that you experienced, but actually also learn some of the tools that if you had in the first place, you wouldn't have likely gotten traumatized and had those stories and fears, etc. So we're joined here today with Dr. Tamara McClintock Greenberg, who is a licensed clinical psychologist. She's in private practice in San Francisco. She's been working to help people impacted by trauma since the 80s when she worked for Child Protective Services. And as a full clinical professor of psychiatry at the University of California, San Francisco, Tamara's writing has focused on caretaking, health psychology, psychodynamic psychology, women's issues and trauma, with the aim of helping people navigate complex physical and/or psychological issues. Tamara is the author of 6 books and numerous contributed chapters. She is champion of combining multiple approaches to treating the nuances and intricacies of psychological problems, and has advocated for integration of psychotherapy methods, as dogmatic adherence to just 1-2 approaches can limit the help that we provide to clients. Tamara has also written for multiple publications, including the Huffington Post, Psych Central, Psychology Today, The Good Men Project, Maria Shriver's website, the San Francisco Chronicle, and has been quoted as an expert in Forbes, USA Today, Newsweek, Next Avenue on PBS, The Washington Post, Care.com, and more. She's been interviewed by numerous radio stations and now here, including several NPR stations and affiliates. Tamara lives in San Francisco with her husband and her 2 pugs, Roscoe and Rufus. And the way that she came into my field of vision is that one of her books is called The Complex PTSD Coping Skills Workbook. It's an evidence-based approach to managing fear and anger, building confidence, and reclaiming your identity. And it's a really powerful workbook because it really addresses what not only are the causes of complex PTSD and what complex PTSD is, but in a language that anybody can really understand and grab hold of the tools that they can use to start healing, to start empowering themselves, to start understanding without actually even going to a therapist. Now, this is not against or instead of obviously working with a therapist, but we should have tools that we can use, a workbook that we can follow, and stuff that we can revisit over and over again. I've gone to therapy and forgotten half of what somebody said to me, but if it's right in front of me in a book, that's very, very helpful. So welcome, Tamara.
Thank you. Thank you.
Welcome, Tamara. And so we'd love to hear a little bit about why you're so passionate about this, and why you're so driven to write these books and to have such a strong voice that's helpful to so many people.
Yeah. There's kind of 2 sort of prongs of this. The first is I grew up in a lower class background in rural Minnesota, and so I had a hard road to get to college. My parents didn't, let's say they weren't raised with the idea of a higher education. And so when I wanted to go to college, they wouldn't sign financial aid forms for me. And so which is common in some rural backgrounds, just to say, but I really did want to go to school. And so basically became independent for 3 years, made my own way, worked a lot. I was always a worker. I worked probably starting when I was about 11, worked through high school, worked through college, worked through graduate school. And I basically, once I was turned 21, I was able to go back to the university that I was accepted to in Minnesota because I could prove that I could make my own living, and so I could take out my own loans. So I really wanted to get a higher education. I majored in psychology, and then when I graduated, I wasn't really sure what I was going to do, but I got a full scholarship to graduate school actually, in for my Psy.D program. It was one of the earliest APA accredited Psy.D programs in the country. And so, went to graduate school. But before that, it's part of my work. I was actually always working in the mental health field. I even did an internship in high school in a behavioral treatment program. So kind of I've worked in the field basically my whole life, not including feeling like a social worker in my family.
Which
As
definitely
is common
qualifies.
for a lot of people in my field, a lot of us are like
Yeah.
the family
Yeah,
therapist.
I was my mom's therapist. I had to fire
Exactly.
myself. Yeah, that happened.
A lot of people in my field are like the family therapist,
Right.
way too young,
Yeah.
right? So yeah, so I worked at Child Protective Services when I was just still going to community college, and was just kind of, captivated by helping people who have struggled. And once I got my doctorate degree and became a psychologist, then it really opened up the doors for me to kind of be a, quote, expert, and to help people in a really different way. And so early in my career, I continued the CPS work, actually doing evaluations for kids who had been abused by their parents, and in situations where there was, trying to determine custody, whether or not someone was parentally fit, what kids' needs were. And then the other specialty I had as a health psychologist was to see people who had medical illnesses. And that was a very practical, from a lower class background kid decision of, if I specialize in working with people with medical problems, I'll always have a job because people are always going to get older and they're always going to get sick. So that was kind of my specialty in graduate school. And when I started working with medical patients, I realized that there's so much trauma that you see in people who have medical issues, just from being sick, right? And worrying about being sick,
Absolutely.
but also like what people go through in the hospital, what people go through with doctors, and I mean, in fact, like, what is the percentage? Like at least a quarter of people with heart disease have PTSD. 30% of people who have cancer diagnoses end up with PTSD. Like, I just started seeing trauma everywhere, both in terms of what people were experiencing as adults, but then also a lot of these folks had traumatic experiences as kids.
Right. Would you say that also that a person who has trauma as in a childhood, that they have more of a predisposition to be to get sick because the stress on the body, the tension, the holding the energy, the blood pressure, the food choices, the behaviors, the stress, the constant thinking, the fight or flight response, like all of that. I mean, a person's body could get worn down. I've seen people with inflammation issues calm down as they start to heal their traumas, and people who are like addicted to like caffeine because they're so utterly exhausted all the time from their inner stuff, right?
You beautifully, succinctly summarized decades of research actually on the issue of why trauma is linked to medical problems in adults. It is, it's about the wear and tear of the body. The fancy name for it is the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis impacts. But you're absolutely right. The end point is inflammation. We don't really understand all of it, but we know that, for example, trauma survivors have more depression, and depression probably leads to an increase of platelet aggregation, where platelets can get stuck in vessels. And they think that that's why, trauma survivors are more likely to have heart attacks. There's a tons of physiological mechanisms. And I think it's important to say, because sometimes people, can get the wrong impression from people in my field that it's kind of all in your head or it's psychosomatic. It's not at all.
Which is
It's
the worst
literally,
thing.
it's right. No, it really is. It's all in the body and it's all in the brain, for sure.
That is the worst thing, the stigma of having any kind of issue at all.
Yep.
It's amazing that in today's day and age that we're still dealing with that. You know, that it's enough that the thing that the don't talk, don't trust, don't feel that a child can experience in their childhood, and even if they don't have it in like a real strong overt way where they have parents who are addicts or mental or experiencing mental illness, they could still have certain traumas that, hey, shake it off. You know, there's like, it's not that big of a deal, or, oh my God, you're exaggerating, or, oh, come on, don't be a drama queen. And,
Yep.
and the society of where we're supposed to act like we have it all together. And we spend so many years just growing up trying to act like we have it all together, and so focused on the outside of our lives as we get less and less present for the inside, for our true experience. And one of the things that I love in your book is that you talk about that like, so people hear the word PTSD and post-traumatic stress disorder, and they think about that, or complex PTSD, and they think, okay, you know, what is that? And they might have connotations of, you know, somebody who maybe is back from war, or, you know, saw something like that, and they don't actually understand how intrinsic it is in our psychology, in our programming, and in our identity. And when you were talking in your workbook, you were talking about how the real issue, it's one thing to give people tools, but the tools have to have a true purpose. And
Right.
if the purpose is to help, and you didn't use this word, but this is what I got out of it, to stop us from internally gaslighting ourselves, you know,
Yeah.
and from listening to people who are telling us that we shouldn't feel what we feel, or that our narrative, you know, that there's something wrong with it. And granted, you know, there are definitely things that we could believe that could put us in that position: shame tapes, fear tapes, identity issues, etc. But I feel, having been somebody who's had severe CPTSD, like, I know that my biggest issue that perpetuated it and made me susceptible to more PTSD was that I could not trust my own instincts, my own intuition. I was so focused on what other people thought, because I had such a shaky sense of self and identity. And so I needed tools that you have in your workbook. I need that kind of dialogue to be able to say, all right, how do I get to a place where I can start to, as they say in recovery, reparent myself and get back in touch and find out, maybe for the first time in my life, what it is that I really think, what I really feel, what really resonates, and start to own it. It's like when there's a saying that a man who stands for nothing can fall for anything. And we've said that before. And so a traumatized individual is so, like, out of their body, out of their self, like they don't know where they stand with something. So they're not deeply rooted in their own convictions and comfortable with it, where they have a sense of peace and empowerment. Where when we're traumatized, we're too flexible with our identity. We're too, like, who do I need to be? We could be chameleons even, and we can even pride ourselves in being that.
Yeah, it's like, tell me who you want me to be so I don't get hurt.
Yeah. Yeah. And who do I need you to be so I don't get hurt? Mm-hmm. You know, and God, if you think you don't have PTSD, ask yourself, do you have like a whole myriad of things that you need to have control over, and ways that people need to interact with you so that you don't end up having a trigger, if you don't end up feeling uncomfortable in your own skin or feeling threatened? I don't know. We talk about all the time about how we want to remove the stigma from addiction. And I feel like doubly so PTSD, because the idea of having any kind of mental illness or anything has too much still in the label of that.
Absolutely. In fact, I mean, you may know, but, complex PTSD has been historically kind of a euphemism for borderline personality
Yeah.
disorder.
Yeah.
And boy, I have
Mm.
such a problem with that for so many
Mm-hmm.
reasons. But the main reason is actually kind of boringly statistical. But I think it's important to say that in terms of the DSM, our psychiatric Bible, in terms of diagnoses, the personality disorders have always historically had a 0.30 inter-rater reliability coefficient. What does that mean? That means that 3 out of 10 clinicians will diagnose somebody with the same personality disorder. They're just really, really limited ways of understanding people. And I think a trauma model and understanding development is so much of a better, saner, more compassionate way of
Yeah.
understanding all
I
of our
wholeheartedly
struggles.
agree. Also, because, and this is my own personal thing. I don't like those labels. I don't like those labels because, and I've said this to Tay Tay many times, like, I don't like the labels because it's like a person commits a crime, they go to jail, then they're a criminal. It's like there's our identity. This is an identity crisis, and so like we
Yep,
don't want to
yep,
identify with a symptom, and a
right.
characteristic and an expression of deeply wounded, like psychology in our programming, right? We want actually to say, okay, what is the real issue, right? I'm believing things that aren't true. I'm holding on to things. I'm not knowing what really resonates. I don't know who I really am. I don't have enough empowerment. That's really the real problem of a lot of this.
Yeah.
And yet, give me a diagnosis, right? Maybe some medication, and I will think it will actually create more problems for me because I will now have a broken story. Like, I am broken. I am damaged. There's something wrong with me. Unless I don't have the desire to do that. But how do you not, when you don't have a strong sense of self in your core, how do you not act like a sponge to opinions and diagnoses and labels and not end up having that sense of like, this is now part of who I am,
Yep,
How do you heal from something you think you are rather than
right.
something you're experiencing?
Well, you're kind of saying the answer in a lot of different ways, which is we have to stop like I call it outsourcing, but it's exactly what you were describing before, where we're not in our minds, we're in everybody else's minds. We want to know what they think of us. We're looking to them to tell us how to behave. And you're right about the trying to manage other people aspect of it, but I do think that, to be honest, I think that's somewhat secondary for people,
Mm-hmm.
at least the people that I see, the survivors that I see. It really is more of a fear-based thing
Yeah.
of, I'll do what you want me to do. And then any kind of secondary aspects of trying to control the environment, it's more like to assure safety.
Oh,
And,
absolutely. Yeah.
you know,
That's what
and
that's what I
so,
was saying. Like we're so controlling of our environment because we don't feel safe. We
yep,
don't feel like we
exactly.
have what we need. We don't feel like who we are even can have what we need for whatever reason. It's the
Exactly.
programming of it.
There's a piece.
Yeah, so the way to start to heal is to slowly, slowly over time practice being more in one's mind. And I would say, like I talk about it in the book, and I've talked about it for years, as developing a relationship with one's mind. One of the things that I think that psychotherapy has done to let people down is that I feel like a lot of people in my field, we assume that the clients who come to us for help, we assume that they're just like us. We assume that they're anxious. We assume that they're thinking about what they're thinking all the time. We assume that they have some semblance of knowing how they're feeling. When the majority of people, especially if they've been traumatized, they've spent so much of their lives outside of their minds
Mm-hmm.
that they need therapists actually to help them do the work to
Absolutely.
be in their minds and to not pathologize people. Right. It's such a cliche, like a therapist says, how do you feel? And the client is like, I don't know. Like it's actually our job to help people be in
Mm-hmm.
their minds slowly over time so they can learn what they're thinking and feeling. Because a lot of people don't know that. And I feel like we've done a lot of damage by pathologizing people who don't know what's on their mind or in their minds.
Yeah, because they could have frozen feelings, right? And I remember when I first, early in recovery, I have 24 years now, clean and sober. So in the very beginning,
Congratulations.
thank you. In the very beginning, we had like those charts with all the little faces that tell you all the different feelings. And I remember thinking, God, that's way too much. Like, why don't we just have it all?
There's so many faces out there.
How many faces are there? And it was cute and everything, but most of the people in that recovery environment couldn't name more than anger or fear, or happiness. And like they couldn't even they weren't actually self-aware enough and given themselves enough permission to even have or even to see the benefit of it. And I found it very interesting that there's the ones that from PTSD who would be overly emoting, and then the ones who, like me, and then the ones who were like, yep, nothing to feel. Nothing here. I'm good. I'm good. What are you talking about? Nothing. There's nothing wrong. Well, my life is really small, but there's nothing wrong. Did you have something, Tete?
I did, actually. So you guys were talking a little bit about like the labels, and how dangerous they can be. And with the work that I do, like I work mostly with chronically mentally ill, and so like I see people that like time and time again own these labels and actually are afraid to do the work to no longer own the label. Like, they're actually afraid.
Who would I be without that?
Who would I be if I didn't have this thing? If I wasn't borderline, then my actions wouldn't be excusable.
Right.
And so how do I heal that if I own it so much, and if I really, really value what I get from it.
Right. And even a diagnosis can be useful in getting attention or getting out of things and not necessarily taking responsibility too. But another thing that's really interesting. So Tay writes medical necessity reviews.
Behavioral health medical
medical necessity reviews. So that people who get denied coverage when they're in the hospital for a period of time, etc., the company that she works for, it's a law firm, they will actually sue to get all of that covered.
Through the appeal process of like insurance companies, and yes. Yeah.
So she's seen all these diagnoses. She has to know what every single form of every kind of diagnosis is. And so she sees the patterns, and we talk about this all the time because of that. And so interestingly enough, to even add one more layer to that on that same thread is when I was first diagnosed with PTSD way many years, way before even getting into recovery, I was put on disability because the trauma was, I was shut down. A panic attack, seizures, like I was not fit for human consumption. And I was on Medicaid, right? And, getting Social Security, yada, yada. And there's a psychology of that. Well, because we have given you this diagnosis, you now have these things paid for you to get help, right? And because you have this diagnosis, now your needs are getting paid for, not really because it wasn't a lot of money, but I digress, to whatever. And there was this psychology of it, of being afraid of not having help anymore and making too much money, or like being afraid of actually healing and associating that in our minds with, if I get better, I will lose something.
Yeah, and that's a big thing, because there is a lot of like, okay, so now I have all these like resources, so if I don't have these resources anymore, I'm going to be this sick again. And, but the majority of people with severe mental health issues can get better and can become productive members of society and don't necessarily have to always be on on these resources. And just giving people that kind of, the tools to be able to see who they actually are is the whole point of like what we do and why we try to like have real conversations about it. Because like when I was like cutting severely, like I couldn't talk to anybody about that. I couldn't even tell my therapist because I was afraid they were going to lock me up. So where are those safe places? Where are those tools? Where are where are all these things that that we can do to kill the stigma, because you know me,
Yeah,
like I am all about killing the stigma because it is killing so many people, as I've said on shows before.
Right.
And we just need to stop. Like we need to stop that and like find resources and find people and do the work and show people that they actually do have value, even though they have this thing that they're working through.
Which is why I love this workbook, because this workbook doesn't go and overly clinicize somebody. They actually, your workbook goes, okay, let's talk about it. I'm going to give you a list of questions. Actually, I even see if I can find it. In your book, you have a list of questions that if you don't think that you have that, hold on 1 second. It'd be nice if I could remember how to use my phone. Okay, I'm back. All right. Screenshots. Here we go. So there's a list of questions and understanding your trauma symptoms.
right.
The following exercise will help you assess your CPTSD symptoms as well as the impacts that it may be having on your identity, your ability to know yourself. Check below if you have any of the following experiences. So I'm going to read them, and those of you in the audience, just consider them. They're not all going to apply to you, but if some of them do, it might give you food for thought.
Mm-hmm.
Feelings of shame or guilt, a sense of meaninglessness, difficulty managing intense emotions, frequent suicidal thoughts and feelings, a feeling of being numb and disconnected from others, a sense of being overactivated and unable to calm down, periods of losing attention and concentration and spacing out, amnesia or loss of memories or events, physical symptoms such as headaches, dizziness, chest pains, and stomach aches, more substance use than you think is common or using substances to become numb, thoughts, memories, or images you try not to think about, a pattern of relationships where you're mistreated but have trouble leaving, exaggerated startle response, for example, jumping if someone comes up behind you, taking more risks than seems normal for you, feedback or your own experience that you might be too angry or irritable or defensive, mistrust in relationships, even when it's not clear that you should be suspicious, overly trusting people who you know on some level may be dangerous, an idea that you have had a number of bad things happen to you which you may or may not remember in detail, specific memories or flashbacks of traumatic events that you don't want to think about, experiencing yourself as uniquely damaged or toxic, a sense of not being real or not feeling like a human being, a sense of numbing and confusion that may lead to self-harm, self-injury, or eating disorders, unexpected thoughts or memories of things you would rather not think about, nightmares, anger blackouts, getting really angry, blowing up, and not remembering it. I always remembered it. Difficulty knowing something that happened. In fact, everybody made sure I remembered it. Difficulty knowing something that happened really happened versus a worry that you made up. A number of intense fears that seem excessive to you. For example, worries about taking public transportation, a fear of being trapped, panic regarding going to the doctor or the dentist, etc. Chronic or severe anxiety, feeling like a failure or feelings of being worthless, difficulty choosing a career, problems working with others or in groups, a general sense that life has no meaning. I mean, if you can identify yourself with any of those, and believe me, most of those I have had in my life, and I feel very grateful that I was aware that I had such a struggle, you know, and then even retroactively to be able to, in my own healing, get to true forgiveness of my family tree that is riddled with aspects of PTSD, not just addiction as well. So thank you so much for putting such a resource out there.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. It sounds like you've done a lot of incredible work.
Oh, yeah, I've had to, and I actually, like, this is the kind of thing, this workbook is the kind of thing that there's a lot of elements in it that I did and that I intuitively knew that I needed to do, and I was terrified to go to a therapist with this stuff. And you know why? This is something to bring up. The reason why is that one of your cute dogs?
Yeah.
There.
Roscoe, actually.
Roscoe.
Yeah.
Roscoe, we're on the air. So my fear of going to a therapist was, and I know that, a therapist isn't supposed to tell you what to think or anything or how to feel about something. But my fear was that I knew how impressionable I was and how vulnerable I was. And if I brought this stuff up, would whatever happened in that therapy session make it worse? I had when I was suicidal, I was suicidal when I was 12, and then again really suicidal. I mean, I had been suicidal with suicidal ideations for a long time, interwoven in my life as like a hobby, but that's what we do. But I could always kill myself was like part of my repertoire, but not so cavalier. But when I was 17, I took 3 years of school in the same year, and I fried out, and I ended up going into, trying to kill myself, going into the psychiatric part of Huntington Hospital in Long Island, New York. Spent 2 months there, found out I graduated while I was there, and started to calm down merely because I had 3 meals a day and none of the seeming outside influences of my environment that I thought was my problem. But when I came out, I was assigned somebody to talk to, and I went to this therapist, and he would start us off. I would actually be in a good mood even that day. We would start off, and he would say, "Okay, so let's talk about something," and he would just dive into something from my past, bring it up. Now I'm experiencing some of the symptoms of my own PTSD, right? And it's like all blah, it's all there on the table. And then, oops, let's wrap this up now because we're about to run out of time. Like 10 minutes, we're going to be closing. And I would literally feel anxiety and sick. I would feel sick, like my stomach was in my chest. I was so like, oh my God. And I would leave there feeling worse. Now, that's not all therapy. But if I have an impression that I'm going to bring up stuff that I don't want to experience in that moment, of stuff that happened that I'm not equipped to deal with, and what happens is I don't get any tool, I don't have any kind of way of protecting myself, I truly believe that is dangerous for somebody like me if the person is not capable of like making sure that I'm protected in it. I was so afraid. So I've had to, because of that fear alone, I've had a very strong guard around my PTSD at the same time. Now, one of the things in your workbook, which I think is phenomenal, is that instead of actually doing that kind of approach of let's go dive into all the things, you have emphasized that what's historical is going to come up now. Like if it's historical, it's historical. If you're triggered by something now, class is in session. And so you don't need to go and pull all the stuff out like that from that perspective. You can, if you get something that you feel like you need to go deeper with somebody, but like this stuff is affecting our present experience. Exactly. For anybody who thinks that they shouldn't look at it, like if you think that you have it safely packed back there, you're wrong, because it's not safely back there. It's part of all the decisions, all the thinking. It's part of our whole makeup of who we think we are and how we see the world. And so it's going to come out in our relationships. It's going to come out at work. It's going to come out when we're driving, when someone cuts us off. It's going to come out when we look in the mirror. It's going to come out in a myriad of ways now, right? So that's why this workbook is so powerful, because when it comes up, now you can start recognizing it and having certain tools.
Yeah, exactly. I think there was this old idea of we have to work through the trauma, which meant, going through all of these painful memories. And first of all, there's just no data that that's actually what makes people better in therapy. Second of all, though, and more importantly, to your point, we are living the past and the present, whether it's with our partners, our dogs, our cats, our mail person, the bus driver, the taxi driver who gives us like uncomfortable feelings. Do you know what I mean? Like there's a way that these things are always coming up. And so you can work in the present. And if people do want to discuss the past, then that's fine, but it does need to come up organically.
Yes.
And not driven by a therapist, because that's just way too controlling and kind of like low-key re-victimizing, actually.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you really have to let clients bring up what is on their minds. And if somebody comes in a good mood, you talk about whatever they want to talk about. It's not about us.
Right.
It's about clients.
Right. It has to be a safe place. But in all fairness, this was a long time ago. Like, I'm 51 now. So we're talking about in the late 80s, early 90s. So it was, I mean, I don't know. I mean, look, there's a reason why you wrote what you wrote, and like why you're such a strong advocate, because you've seen that kind of thinking. That's a lot of the way that we are trying to help each other, that even if our heart's in the right place, could be using antiquated and, you know, I love what you said about in your workbook about Freud, and about how his approach was even affected by his colleagues, because wasn't he helping his colleagues' children or something?
And they were complaining about abuse. And so when he published, you know, it was called Studies on Hysteria, but when he published it, he was talking about abuse, he was talking about fear and anger, and he was a neurologist, remember? So he really understood the body. He thought of these things and described these things in bodily terms. I mean, just translate the language to now. It's so similar to what you see people writing about all the time. He was onto something, but then he got shut down because look, we don't want to talk about child abuse, right? I mean, we still don't.
Right. And there's, I mean, while there are children who can lie and make up stories, the majority have a deeper reason to say what they're saying. And even if they have a story that maybe is not 100% based on fact, there's still something to see there. There's something going on, because no child goes, you know what? I don't really want to play on the swings today. And I don't really want to play video games. What I really want to do is be shut down in the corner and not want to talk to anybody, and then have a story about why I'm doing that. Like, that's not, nobody says, this sounds like fun.
Right.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about, like, you were talking about how your experience was a long time ago. When I first did EMDR, like the first time I did EMDR, it was someone that had just started practicing EMDR, and she was actually getting her certification at the time. And it brought up a pretty big trauma that I wasn't ready to work through, especially not with her. And I didn't have, and even though I had, you know, years of education and years of this and years of that, I didn't have the right tools for that particular trauma at that particular time, because I didn't even know how to process it. Like, I didn't even know, like, where to go to talk about it. Because there's this other piece of, don't you know who I think I am? Because I have letters after my name too, you know, so you know, so books like this, workbooks like this, like it's another level of, okay, this is how you see this, and this is how it's different. And, you know, even Freud had people pushing him back about what he was doing, because it is so hard to talk about, and so hard to heal.
It's true about a lot of the modalities, even over time, is that, you know, there is that collegiate pressure. I mean, you don't really want to be the person that goes against everybody else. You want to be able to, you know, get your papers reviewed, and you want to be able to be a known name, you know. And so I could, you know, we're all at the end of the day human, so I could see why that could have gone that way. But so we talked about CPTSD and PTSD, but we never really talked about what the difference is between these two diagnoses, right?
Right.
Can you, I mean, I could talk about what the difference is in my experience, but I would like you to talk about, in your experience, what you would say the difference is between complex PTSD and PTSD.
Yeah, simple, what we used to call simple PTSD, which isn't so simple if you've been through it, but Right. Primary PTSD usually involves 1 to 2 discrete events, often in adulthood, that lead to the kind of classical symptoms that you know about:
Mm-hmm.
psychic numbing, nightmares, flashbacks. Complex PTSD, the best way to describe it is it's the aggregate of difficult life events, and they usually start in childhood. Excuse me. So it's basically, a difficult childhood. And then since trauma begets trauma, you
Right.
see people who have histories of trauma become more likely to be traumatized as adults. And actually, in the case of substance abuse, one of the things that they found is that, substance abuse, it puts you at risk for victimization. It's an attempt to sort of ward off some of these feelings, but folks who abuse substances can also be re-traumatized
Yeah.
through, aspects of that lifestyle.
Mm-hmm.
So, but it happens to everybody. You don't even have to be substance abusing to have that happen.
Yeah.
It's just something that happens.
Absolutely. I used to joke that I had to heal from things that didn't happen
Mm-hmm.
because
Yeah.
I hallucinated when I did drugs, and it wasn't necessarily fun,
Right.
but also, when you're willing to self-medicate, so if you already have PTSD, where you're questioning your own judgment and not having your own strong convictions, and then you
Yeah.
add a substance to the mix where you're going to less be your own best advocate. And now you might end up in situations that bring about negative reactions and effects. Maybe you get pulled over, maybe you end up waking up with somebody in your bed, maybe you don't,
Yeah.
you end up in somebody else's bed, maybe you end up in a street, you don't know what happened, and
Right.
and not even knowing, or the blackouts, and
Mm-hmm.
so addiction itself can create trauma, but a person wouldn't necessarily be so attracted to what an addiction can be for that person if they didn't already have some level of PTSD going on already. We had an episode on veterans in recovery, and we were talking about how a lot of people who are attracted to the military already have chronic complex PTSD,
Yeah.
because they're looking for a sense of identity. They're looking for a place to belong. They need some structure, etc. Now, not everybody, but there's an attraction for that, And when they go, now they don't necessarily have the tools to handle some of their emotionality, and so something happens, and they're expected to be tough. They're expected to keep it together, and inside, they're not okay. And so
Right.
they might get diagnosed as with PTSD finally, right?
Mm-hmm.
When they come out, but on a deeper dive, one would find that they already had it before that even happened, and it's important. I think sometimes also, I know this. There is, like we said earlier. People don't want to have a label, right? So they don't want to diagnose themselves. They don't want the diagnosis of having something. Maybe they want to be stronger. Maybe they want to seem like something didn't bother them. Maybe they're afraid of having to talk about, if I talk about that I have PTSD, I'll have to tell you why. Maybe it was child abuse. Maybe it was sexual abuse. Maybe it's something I don't want to talk to people about. And so we're very guarded in our shaky sense of self and our identity over, and protecting, in my opinion, not entirely the right thing, like being defensive and guarding against, hey, nothing to look at here. I don't have a problem. I'm good.
Well, and I think trauma survivors also are really, really good at blaming themselves for their issues.
Yeah.
And this is an idea from Judith Herman, who she's the one who coined the term complex post-traumatic stress disorder back in the 80s, I believe it was. She said, and this is so brilliant, she said that people with complex PTSD, they know they have problems, but they don't link their trauma to their problems.
Yeah.
They think there's something wrong with them, that they're damaged in some way.
Yeah. It's when you don't know what makes a feeling, and you
Yep.
just have a feeling as if it just comes from nowhere.
Right.
And you think, I am having this feeling. There's something wrong with me. I'm not able to control myself. I'm not able to manage the situation. So I need something to fix that outside of me. But when you know that you're not going to have a feeling if you don't have a deeply rooted or vehemently believed idea, Like you have to have something that you're investing in your mind in some way, shape, or form to have any kind of feeling. Like to have even happiness. You have to say, that makes me happy, or I'm happy because of that.
Well, you also have to know what happiness is, because when you're in this, like before you have the tools and before you've done the work and all those things, the word happy for me was some kind of crazy unattainable goal that isn't real,
Yeah.
and so like finding out like, oh, that's not actually what happiness is,
right.
and being okay with this other level of like joy or peace or serenity or like what happiness actually is, because what I thought happiness was not something that anybody could ever achieve. And and to be okay with that, and to find a different definition,
and also to be so chronically uncomfortable in your own skin that you vibrate, like
and
the idea of being comfortable in your own skin seems like an impossibility,
definitely,
because it's crowded.
Well, and we know the idea of being sober at one time was an impossibility, and now 15 years later it's like the idea of being high is an impossibility. But there's been a lot of work that happened to get to that point.
So we talk about in your workbook, you're talking about how these emotions, like even in the title, about fear, about anger. I heard this thing once where it said, fear is I'm not going to get what I want or need. Anger is I'm not getting what I want or need. And resentment is I didn't get what I wanted or needed. And so there's so much narration of victim, even if we don't really see it that way. We don't like the word victim, but there's so much of powerlessness and more importantly, because that word is so used in the 12-step programs, more a lack of empowerment. Just to be able to process real time in this moment what is happening, to consider, to be present with ourselves, and to be able to not have a hysterical reaction or shut down, shut people out, stop this, leave this job, leave these people, etc. To have fear, to have anger.
Right.
A person may not think they have PTSD, and so they may want to say, well, I need to fix this feeling still, right? So they might be attracted to, well, let me dive into this. And so these are symptoms. Just like alcohol and drugs were a symptom, okay, of an inner condition that we were in so much discord. Anger and fear, and sadness and depression, these are all symptoms, and that's all it is. It's not that it's not that there's something wrong with you from a perspective of keeping it together, that there's something going on with you that's going on in your thinking. And so if you could share a little bit about why so much you emphasize fear and anger in your workbook, and to apply these tools to let people real time have new coping skills.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, look, nobody wants to feel fear and nobody wants to feel anger, but unfortunately, those are all part of the human condition, no matter what we've been through. But if you've been through a lot of trauma, you're going to have more of it, and it sucks, right? I mean, there's just no question about it. It just sucks. And so, but the way human psychology works is the more we try to get rid of negative or uncomfortable feelings, the more they haunt us. So the point is to try to slowly over time understand the fear, understand the anger, understand the relationship between the two, right? Because sometimes anger can be a way to organize fear or sadness, and fear can be a way to not feel anger.
Absolutely.
And one of the most interesting things about people who are like so-called angry people is that they were remarkably terrible at being assertive.
That's so true.
They have such trouble actually taking care of themselves. So it's really just kind of sitting with people and encouraging people to just sort of, think about these emotions in a neutral way and try to understand what's driving them, and sometimes it really is just fear. People have a lot of fear if you've been traumatized, and that fear is going to live with you. But at other times, the fear might be a mask for my partner's not treating me very well, and I really need to stand up to them, and I got to figure out how to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And instead of being able to say, no, knock it off, I'm going to go into a kind of panic spiral, and act like there's something wrong with me when what I really need to do is tell someone no.
This is a really good point, because when I was going through a lot of my healing from PTSD, every time I would be in a dysfunctional relationship, and I mean every time, meaning there's several dysfunctional relationships, I would go, oh, I wish I wasn't so effed up. I wish I didn't have these issues. I know I'm too much. I know, and if and they would be so glad to let it be my responsibility too. And then I had this awakening that was like, oh, it was the most amazing thing. And it was, while it is true that my interactions with people and my interpretation of those events led me to be really triggered by, if I'm in a situation, in an intimate situation, and I'm vulnerable, if a certain thing is going on, as I was questioning what healthy looked like, I started finding out there's a secondary reason why I'm getting triggered in my PTSD, and that is because some of the stuff that happened before is actually happening now, which is why this relationship isn't working, that the person is ghosting or acting like I'm making a big deal out of nothing, that the person, you know what I mean? Stuff like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's why so this is one of the reasons I'm so passionate about this. If you think that there's no reason to look at this stuff, if you think there's no reasons to question some of this stuff and to get tools, just trust that if nothing changes, nothing changes. Mm-hmm. And we think that we have all of these coping mechanisms that we ourselves use when we have PTSD. They're not the coping tools. They're just these reactions, these self-protective mechanisms. These things that we believe are helping us, just like we might have thought the alcohol or the drugs was helping us, right? They're actually hurting us, because if we keep our PTSD intact, we are blind. We are not able to truly take care of ourselves in a situation. We will end up in dysfunctional relationships or afraid to even get into a relationship because we don't have any clue what's really going on. Because we don't know what's going on with us.
And not just romantic relationships.
Everything.
Any relationship. Like, you're afraid to have friends. You're afraid to be close to your family. You're just afraid to people because...
But it may not even look that way. You may think you've got it. You're keeping everybody at an arm's distance.
Right.
You're managing things, but you're not going deep. You're not sharing things. You're coexisting. But yeah. I think there's so much here. I mean, we could talk for hours on the subject. It's just, it's such a big deal to bring out this verbiage and say, let's just make it a matter-of-fact conversation. Because if there is a feeling that you don't feel empowered, if you feel like you're uncomfortable in your own skin, if you're afraid of facing things in your life, if you've ever been in a situation where you feel like that should have gone differently, but it didn't, if in your rearview mirror you have relationships where you want to blame the other person even for being a narcissist or a psychopath or anything, healing takes place when we take personal responsibility for it and we say, you know what, sure, I could say, if I only had one isolated incident in my life, that this was a person that was just not healthy for me and it's all their fault. But if we're willing to have self-compassion and to do tools like this great workbook and to talk to people who can have this kind of conversation, we start to find out, armed with our own self-honesty and self-love, we start to actually find out what's really going on with us, why we're so willing to put ourselves, to be attracted to a situation and stay in whatever it is, long after it's, by anybody's account, reasonable to be there. So we're reaching the end of this amazingly powerful hour, and is there anything else that you would like to share with our viewers or listeners?
I mean, thank you so much. I mean, I'm touched by your comments and your passion for the workbook. I'm really glad you found it useful. I think the biggest thing is just to reiterate, it's so easy for people who've been traumatized to blame themselves. And, it's a balance of taking personal responsibility, focusing on the inside, less on the outside, but also realizing, because these things coexist, that we feel guilty, we feel bad, like we've done something wrong. And so it's really important to remember that, we can take more control of our lives, have more of a relationship with our own minds, and also not blame ourselves as much. They all go together. And it's a hell of a lot easier to live life when you know what your feelings are and you know how to take care of yourself.
Yeah. There's a saying in recovery that we are always looking for the easier, softer way. And it wasn't until many years into recovery that I realized that the easier, softer way is actually through it.
Yep, exactly.
So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, Tay,
you
for joining us
guys.
here.
You guys are amazing and great, and thank you so much.
Thank you. The opinions expressed here are strictly those of the people who gave them. It doesn't represent any 12-step program or should replace your own intuition or professional medical advice. You can watch us on Facebook, YouTube, on Amazon Fire TV. You can listen to us on the PHLB radio app. You can get our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and iHeartRadio and Alexa. And you can go to themeetingspace.com and click on The Real Recovery Show and see all of our episodes there at any time. And please do share it with other people that you feel could help or that might be interested. And if you're looking to be on a show, there's an intake form on that page as well. You just click on the link and fill it out and let us know what you would like to talk about. So thank you again for joining us today. Thank you, Tamara. And we'd like to give a special thanks as well to our sponsor and gracious host, PHLB Radio here in Las Vegas. See you next week.